It was a cold, rainy evening when Jake first heard it, a tiny, desperate cry echoing through the empty alley behind his apartment. The sound was so faint that at first he thought he imagined it, but then, there it was again, a soft, pitiful mew, barely audible over the pouring rain. Something inside him stirred. He wasn't the kind of guy to go looking for trouble, but this wasn't trouble. This was a life, a helpless creature calling out for help. He grabbed his flashlight and stepped into the alley, his breath visible in the freezing air. His boots splashed through puddles as he followed the sound, scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. Then, he saw it, a tiny, shivering kitten, huddled beneath a dumpster, its fur soaked through, its frail body trembling. Its eyes, wide and golden, locked onto his with an intensity that sent a shiver down his spine. Jake crouched down, reaching out cautiously. "Hey there, little one," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. The kitten didn't run. It didn't hiss. It just stared at him unblinking, as if it had been waiting for him all along. Carefully, he scooped it up, feeling the rapid flutter of its heartbeat against his palm. It was light, too light as if it hadn't eaten in days. He tucked it into his jacket, shielding it from the wind. The kitten didn't protest. Instead, it let out a soft, exhausted sigh and nestled into the warmth of his chest. Back in his apartment, Jake wrapped the kitten in a towel and set it by the heater. He expected it to be skittish, to hide under the couch or claw at him in fear. But instead, it sat there, watching him with an eerie stillness, as if studying him. There was something different about this kitten. It barely blinked. Its movements were precise, almost calculated, not the clumsy, playful behavior you'd expect from a stray. And then, there was the way it responded to his voice, tilting its head ever so slightly, as if it understood every word he said. Jake chuckled, shaking his head. "You're a strange one, huh?" The kitten let out a tiny chirp in response, and for a moment, he swore he saw something flicker in its golden eyes, something ancient. Days passed, and the kitten, whom he named Luna, quickly settled into his life. She was unlike any cat he'd ever seen. She never knocked things over. She never meowed for food. Instead, she would simply look at him, and he'd somehow know exactly what she needed. She would sit by the door before he got home, waiting, as if she could sense his arrival before he even stepped into the building. And then there were the nights. Jake would often wake up to find Luna sitting at the foot of his bed, staring out the window. Her ears would twitch at sounds only she could hear, her body tense, alert. Sometimes she would let out a low, guttural growl, not the sound of a frightened kitten, but something deeper, older, a warning. What was she hearing? One night, around 3 a.m., Jake jolted awake. The room was silent, but something felt off. A prickling sensation ran down his spine. Luna was at the window again, but this time, she wasn't just staring. She was growling, low and menacing. Jake sat up, his heart pounding. He followed her gaze to the darkened street below. There was nothing there, nothing he could see. But Luna's fur bristled, her body tense with something close to fear. And then, just as suddenly as it began, she stopped. Her ears twitched, her head cocked slightly, listening. Then she turned to Jake and did something that sent a chill through his veins. She placed a tiny paw on his chest and pushed, hard, like she was trying to tell him something, like she was warning him. Jake swallowed hard, a nervous chuckle escaping his lips. "Luna, what are you?" She blinked at him, and in that moment, deep in her golden eyes, he swore. He saw something that made his stomach drop, something that told him Luna wasn't just a cat, and whatever she was, she had chosen him for a reason. For the first time in a long time, Jake didn't feel alone. He wasn't sure why. Maybe it was the way Luna followed him around the apartment like a shadow, never demanding attention but always there. Or maybe it was the quiet comfort of knowing that when he woke up from another restless night, she'd be curled up beside him, her tiny body rising and falling in steady, rhythmic breaths. Before Luna, Jake had grown used to silence. It had been nearly a year since he left his old life behind, the life he'd built with Sarah. They were supposed to have forever, supposed to buy the house with the big backyard, supposed to adopt a dog, supposed to grow old together, but forever had unraveled in a single moment. In the screech of tires and the shattering of glass, the accident stole everything. Sarah had been driving home late from work, too exhausted to see the truck that ran the red light. By the time Jake got the call, it was too late. The world had kept spinning, but for him, time had stopped. He left the city, quit his job, moved into a small, nondescript apartment on the edge of town where no one knew his name and no one asked questions. And for a while, that was enough. Until Luna, until this tiny, strange, unnervingly intelligent kitten forced her way into his life like she had always belonged there. He didn't realize just how much she meant to him until one night, a few weeks after he found her. It was past midnight, and Jake was drowning in memories again, staring at an untouched glass of whiskey on the coffee table. He hadn't cried in months, hadn't let himself cry, but that night, the weight of everything pressed down on him like a collapsing ceiling. Then he felt it, a soft pressure on his lap. Luna had jumped up, settling onto him with the kind of ease that said, "I know you need this." She didn't purr, didn't rub her head against his hand like a normal cat might. She just sat there, watching him, grounding him. Jake exhaled shakily, running a hand over his face. "You always know, don't you?" he murmured. Luna blinked, her golden eyes steady and knowing. That was the moment Jake realized she wasn't just a pet. She was something more. "Dude, I'm telling you, that is not a normal cat." Jake rolled his eyes, tossing a handful of treats onto the counter. Luna, as usual, didn't react like a regular cat. She didn't pounce or meow in excitement. Instead, she stared at the treats for a moment before carefully selecting one and eating it, as if analyzing its quality first. Across the kitchen, Jake's best friend and coworker, Ryan, watched with open suspicion. "I mean, come on," Ryan continued, gesturing toward Luna with his beer bottle. "She doesn't do cat things. She doesn't knock stuff over. She doesn't beg for food. She just sits there, watching, like she's waiting for you to screw up." Jake snorted. "She's just different." Ryan raised an eyebrow. "Yeah, that's one way to put it." Jake leaned against the counter, crossing his arms. "What? You think she's what? Some kind of supernatural omen or something?" Ryan hesitated. "Look, man, I don't know, but animals, they sense things. And this one, it's like she knows something you don't." Jake wanted to brush it off, wanted to tell Ryan he was being ridiculous, but the truth was he'd been thinking the same thing, because Luna's strange behavior wasn't just quirky anymore. She always knew when someone was at the door before they knocked. She never played with toys, but she'd sit and stare at certain objects in his apartment like she was trying to remember something. And then there were the nights when she would wake him up, just before something happened. Last week, it had been the fire alarm from the apartment next door. The week before that, the sudden burst of car alarms in the street. She always knew. And now, sitting on the counter, Luna was staring at Ryan, watching him, the way she watched everything. Ryan shifted uncomfortably. "All right, well, that's my cue to leave," he muttered, finishing his beer. Jake chuckled, but deep down he couldn't shake the feeling gnawing at the back of his mind. Ryan wasn't wrong. Something about Luna was different, and if she was sensing something, what exactly was it? The answer came sooner than Jake expected. It was late, past 2 a.m., when he woke up to Luna standing at the foot of the bed, her ears perked, her body completely still. Jake rubbed his eyes. "Luna?" She didn't look at him. Instead, she was staring at the door. A second later, a sharp knock echoed through the apartment. Jake's stomach dropped. Who the hell was knocking at this hour? He hesitated before getting up, his heart pounding. Luna didn't move from her spot. She just kept watching the door. Another knock. Harder this time. Jake took a slow breath and stepped forward, peeking through the peephole. No one was there. A chill ran down his spine. He turned back to Luna, his pulse racing. "What is this?" he whispered. She blinked, and then with deliberate, eerie slowness, she turned her head toward the window. Jake followed her gaze, and outside in the darkness of the empty street, something moved. Something big, something that shouldn't be there. His breath hitched, his body locked in place. And then, for the first time since he found her, Luna let out a sound that sent ice through his veins. A low guttural growl, not a kitten's growl, not even a cat's. It was deeper, older, not human. Jake swallowed hard, his mind spinning. Luna knew. She had always known. And now, standing in the dim glow of his apartment, Jake realized something terrifying. Luna hadn't just chosen him. She had been sent to him, and whatever was outside, it was coming for him next. Jake barely slept after that night. The feeling of being watched, of something lurking just beyond his line of sight, had burrowed deep into his bones. He told himself it was paranoia, that his mind was playing tricks on him. But no matter how much he tried to rationalize it, Luna knew. She started acting differently, more alert, more protective. She followed Jake everywhere now, her golden eyes always scanning, always searching for something he couldn't see. And then there were the incidents. At first, they were small things. The feeling of pressure on his chest in the middle of the night, like something was leaning over him. The sound of scratching at the apartment door, but when he checked, the hallway was empty. His phone's alarm going off at random times, 3:07 a.m., always. And Luna's reaction? Every time she would growl, low, deep, and menacing, the kind of sound a predator makes before striking. Then, one night, it escalated. Jake came home late from work, his mind foggy with exhaustion. The apartment was dark when he stepped inside, the only light coming from the street lamp outside his window. He kicked off his shoes, tossed his keys on the counter, and called out automatically, "Luna?" Silence. A knot of unease formed in his stomach. She always greeted him at the door. Always. Jake moved through the apartment, his pulse quickening. The living room was empty, the kitchen silent. Then he saw it. The bedroom door was open. He never left it open. Slowly, cautiously, he stepped inside and froze. Luna was sitting on the bed, her fur bristling, her body completely rigid, and her eyes weren't on him. They were locked on the closet. Jake's breath hitched. He followed her gaze, his heart pounding. The closet door was open, just an inch. He hadn't left it open. He knew that for a fact. A cold dread seeped into his bones. Slowly, he reached for the closet handle, his fingers trembling. He took a breath, steeling himself. Then, in one quick motion, he yanked the door open. Nothing. No one was there. But the air was wrong. It was freezing, unnaturally so. His breath came out in visible puffs even though the heater was on, and the smell, it was faint, but distinct, metallic, like rust or blood. Jake stumbled back, his chest tightening. Luna didn't move. She just kept staring, and that was when he saw it. The scratch marks, deep, jagged gouges in the wooden floor of the closet, like something had been dragged inside. His stomach twisted. He looked down at Luna, his voice barely a whisper. "What the hell is happening?" She blinked. Then in one smooth motion she jumped into the closet. Jake's heart nearly stopped. "Luna, wait!" She didn't hesitate. She pressed her small body against the back wall and let out a low, almost mournful sound. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, she raised her paw and tapped against the wood. Tap, tap, tap. Jake swallowed hard. His hands were shaking now as he knelt beside her, running his fingers along the spot where she had tapped. The wood was smooth, normal, but then he pressed a little harder, and the panel shifted. His breath caught. There was a hollow space behind the wall. Something was inside. It took everything in Jake not to bolt out of the apartment right then and there, but he couldn't ignore this. Whatever this was, Luna had led him to it. With shaking hands, he pried the panel loose, revealing a small, dusty compartment, and inside, a box. It was old, wooden, with intricate carvings along the edges. A small metal clasp held it shut, rusted, from time. Jake hesitated before reaching for it, his pulse hammering in his ears. The moment his fingers touched the wood, Luna hissed, not at him, at the box. A surge of nausea rolled through Jake's stomach. He could feel it, an unnatural wrongness radiating from the box like it had been sitting in the dark, forgotten and festering for far too long. His instincts screamed at him to put it back, to burn it, but he couldn't. He had to know. Carefully, he unlatched the clasp and opened the lid. Inside, wrapped in brittle yellowed paper, was a photo, a black and white photograph of a man, and that man was him. His vision blurred, his breath came in shallow gasps. This wasn't possible. This photo looked old, decades old. The edges were worn, the ink slightly faded, but the man in the picture, it was him. Same face, same tired eyes, and standing beside him, a cat, Luna. Jake's stomach twisted. He flipped the photo over with trembling fingers. There was writing on the back, faded but still legible. "Protect him. He doesn't remember." Yet, a chill shot through his spine. He swallowed, his mind spinning. This didn't make sense. How could this photo exist? How could he be in it? And why did Luna look exactly the same? The air in the apartment suddenly felt suffocating. Jake ran a hand through his hair, trying to ground himself. That was when he noticed something else in the box. A small metal key, rusty, but intact. And next to it, something even stranger. A folded newspaper clipping. Jake unfolded it, his hands trembling. The headline made his blood run cold. "Man found dead in apartment. Unsolved case from 1963. Jake's eyes darted to the photo in the article. It was him. His pulse roared in his ears. His hands were ice cold. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. Jake looked down at Luna, his heart hammering against his ribs. She was staring at him again, not with fear, but with understanding, as if she had seen all of this before, as if she had been here before. Jake's hands clenched around the newspaper. His voice was barely a whisper. "Luna, who are you?" She didn't answer, but she didn't need to, because deep down, in the marrow of his bones, Jake already knew. Luna wasn't just a cat, she was his guardian. She had always been, and whatever had happened before, it was about to happen again. The weight of the newspaper clipping burned in Jake's hands. "Man found dead in apartment, unsolved case from 1963. The photograph, the key, the hidden box, and Luna. His pulse was erratic, his breathing shallow. None of this made sense, and yet, deep down, it did. Some part of him knew this wasn't a coincidence. Luna hadn't just wandered into his life. She had been here before, and now she was watching him with those knowing golden eyes, as if waiting. Then, the lights flickered. Jake froze. The air turned thick, charged like static before a storm. His ears popped, and then, the apartment door slammed shut. A rush of icy wind blasted through the room, knocking over the lamp, plunging everything into darkness. Luna's fur bristled. She let out a low, guttural growl, and from the closet, voice a whisper. "You shouldn't have found it." Jake's blood turned to ice. The voice was distorted, like someone speaking from underwater. It wasn't coming from a phone or a speaker. It was inside the room. Luna crouched low, her tail lashing. Her ears flattened against her skull and her body trembled, not in fear but in rage. Then the whispering turned into a scream, a deafening, ear-splitting roar that shook the entire apartment. The walls groaned, the floor vibrated, and then it stepped out of the closet, a shadow, a figure impossibly tall and wrong, its body shifting like smoke. Its face was almost human, distorted, stretched, its mouth too wide, its eyes hollow. Jake's breath hitched. His legs refused to move. The figure tilted its head. "You shouldn't be here." Then it lunged. Before Jake could react, Luna leapt. Blur of white fur, her body colliding with the shadow midair. The creature let out a horrific screech as Luna sank her claws into it, not just scratching, burning. Wherever her paws touched, the darkness recoiled, sizzling like water on a hot bun. The shadow twisted, trying to shake her off, but she held on, snarling, her small body thrashing against it. Jake scrambled backward, his mind screaming at him to run, but something in him knew. If he ran, it wouldn't end. This wasn't just a random spirit. It was here for him, and it always had been. Luna clawed at the creature's face, her eyes glowing like embers. The thing howled, its form flickering, warping, and for the first time Jake saw something beneath the shadow. A face, not a monster's, a man's, his own. The realization hit Jake like a freight train. This wasn't a haunting. This wasn't a random ghost. This was him, or rather, the version of him that had died in this apartment decades ago. A loop, a cycle, repeating itself. The old photograph, the newspaper article, the scratches in the floor, the strange familiarity. Jake wasn't the first. Jake and Luna. She had been trying to stop it, to save him. His vision blurred, the weight of it all pressed down on him. The choices he had made, the warning signs he had ignored, and now it was happening again. The shadow turned toward him, its form flickering between man and monster. Jake's own voice came from its lips. "You can't stop it." "You never do," Luna hissed. Her body arched, and with one final, desperate motion, she lunged for the shadow's throat. The impact sent out a blinding shockwave of light. Jake threw his arms up to shield himself, and everything went silent. When Jake opened his eyes, the room was still. The air was no longer cold. The walls had stopped groaning. The apartment door stood open, and the shadow was gone. Jake's hands were shaking as he looked around, and then his breath caught. She lay on the floor, her small body still. "No," his voice broke. He stumbled forward, dropping to his knees beside her. His hands hovered over her fur, unwilling to accept what he was seeing. "Luna, come on, wake up." Her sides didn't rise. Her eyes, those fierce, knowing golden eyes, were half-lidded, unfocused. Jake's chest tightened. She had saved him. She had broken the cycle, but it had cost her everything. A choked sob tore from his throat. He scooped her up, cradling her against his chest. Her fur was still warm. "Please," he whispered. "Please don't do this." But she didn't move. She had given everything for him, and now she was gone. Jake sat there for what felt like hours, holding Luna in his arms. The weight of the truth settled over him. The past versions of himself had always failed. The cycle had always won. But this time, Luna had fought. She had saved him. She had changed everything. Tears blurred his vision as he pressed his forehead against her fur. "Thank you," he whispered. "I'm so sorry." Then, a faint vibration against his chest. Jake's breath hitched. He pulled back, and in the stillness of the room, Luna's tail twitched. A sharp inhale rattled through Jake's lungs. He watched, wide-eyed, as Luna's tiny body stirred. Her chest rose in a shallow, weak breath. Her ears flicked, and then, those golden eyes opened. Jake let out a sound between a sob and a laugh. "You little fighter." His hands shook as he stroked her fur. "You never give up, do you?" Luna blinked slowly, then nudged her head against his palm. Jake laughed, his heart swelling with relief. The cycle was broken. He was alive, and so was she. The dawn light streamed through the apartment window, casting a soft glow over the room. It felt different now, lighter, warmer. The heavy, suffocating presence that had haunted this place for so long was gone. Jake sat on the couch, cradling Luna in his lap. She was still weak, her breathing shallow, but she was alive, and that was all that mattered. His fingers ran gently through her soft fur, his heart swelling with a kind of gratitude he had never known before. "You saved me," he whispered. "I don't even know how to begin thanking you." Luna let out a soft purr, nuzzling into his hand as if to say, "That's what I was meant to do." Jake exhaled shakily. Everything made sense now. The strange familiarity, the unshakable feeling of déjà vu, the way Luna had come into his life exactly when he needed her most. She had been watching over him, guiding him. She had broken the cycle, and she had chosen him to live. That afternoon, Jake stood in front of his apartment building, the crisp autumn air filling his lungs. He held a small worn box, the one he had found hidden under the floorboards, the one that had led him down this path. Inside were the remnants of another life, photographs, letters, pieces of a history that had been erased by time. His past self, another version of him, had lived and died in that apartment, trapped in a cycle of fear and loss. But not this time. Jake knelt down and carefully dug a small hole beneath the oak tree that stood tall in the courtyard. He placed the box inside and covered it with earth, pressing his palm against the ground for a moment as if saying a final goodbye. "You can rest now," he murmured. "We're free." Luna, still recovering, sat beside him, her tail curled around her paws. She watched him with those knowing golden eyes, and for the first time since he had found her, Jake swore he saw something new in them. Peace. She had done what she came here to do, and now they could finally move forward. Life had a way of shifting when you least expected it. In the weeks that followed, Jake slowly started putting the pieces of his life back together. He quit his dead-end job and applied for one that actually mattered, a job at an animal rescue center. The idea had never crossed his mind before, but now it felt right, because if Luna had taught him anything, it was that sometimes the smallest, most unexpected creatures could save you in ways you never imagined, and he wanted to do the same for others. Luna, ever the warrior, recovered quickly. She still had her quirks, her habit of watching him from across the room as if making sure he was still real, her way of tilting her head as though she could see things he couldn't. But now, there was an ease to her, a lightness. The nightmares were gone. The weight in Jake's chest had lifted. For the first time in as long as he could remember, he felt like he was really living. One evening, as Jake sat on the couch with Luna curled beside him, a gentle knock sounded at the door. He frowned. He wasn't expecting anyone. When he opened it, an elderly woman stood there, her silver hair pulled into a loose bun. She looked at him for a long moment, before offering a small, sad smile. "You're him," she whispered. Jake's breath caught. "I'm sorry. Do we know each other?" She shook her head. "No, but I knew the man who lived here before, a long time ago." A chill ran down Jake's spine. She glanced past him, her eyes landing on Luna. Her expression softened. "She came back," she murmured. Jake felt a lump form in his throat. You know about her?" The woman nodded, her eyes glistening. "She was his, my brother's. He loved her more than anything. But when he was gone, she disappeared. I always wondered if she was waiting for him." Jake looked down at Luna, his heart hammering in his chest. All this time, she hadn't just been trying to save him. She had been waiting for him to come back. The woman reached out, hesitated, then smiled. "She's yours now. Take care of her." Jake swallowed hard and nodded. "I will." As the woman turned to leave, Jake looked down at Luna, who was watching him with those deep, ancient eyes. He crouched beside her, scratching behind her ears. You knew all along, didn't you?" he murmured. Luna blinked slowly, and in that moment Jake knew. Some bonds never break, not through time, not through death. Some souls always find their way back to each other, and they had finally found their way home.